Welcome to part 3 of your AP Econ Macroecon review. Just trying to put a few of those graphs that we looked at into practice here. And so our scenario here is the U.S. economy is in recession because consumer confidence fell on fears of problems in the global economy, so we follow Keynesian economics and increase government spending while the Fed increases the money supply. So let's graph a few of those things there. Let's start with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. All these graphs, it is fairly important to have good labels. I'm going to just label it as price level there. And we've got aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And of course what had happened, consumer confidence had fallen. So we had been at, full employment, and then price level, that's where we started, and we were at that full employment. Of course, then what had happened was consumer confidence had fallen. People would stop buying stuff. Aggregate demand is going to decrease. We're going to slide into a recession. And we have a recessionary gap. That's where we are before the government tries to intervene. What had happened in the consumption function, remember when we draw this graph, we always have our 45-degree line, the y equals x line. On one axis, on the x-axis, we have our income, national income, which is really synonymous with GDP. And on the y-axis, we have the expenditure. It's really planned expenditure. Sorry, that's really sloppy writing there. And then we had our consumption function, something that looked like this. Remember, this was our level of autonomous spending, and this is now our equilibrium, and we had been at full employment, so that was our income at full employment. Well, what happened when consumer confidence fell? Our consumption dropped, and that could have either been our marginal propensity to consume was actually dropping a little, or maybe some of our autonomous spending dropped as well as businesses got nervous. Both effects would have the same effect there. And we had slipped to a recession there. We had slipped. And then on the Phillips curve, if we're drawing that, what had happened, let's see, we're going to draw a short run Phillips curve. What am I forgetting? Sorry, unemployment and inflation is our y-axis. And this was our long run Phillips curve with some sort of inflation rate. And our unemployment rate was at full employment, so we'll call that at the natural rate of, say, 5%. What happened, we went into a recession, so of course unemployment went up. And now we have an unemployment level of, I'm just going to say greater than 5%. And we have probably decreasing inflation. So the quantity of unemployment is greater than 5%. I'll just label that as Q1. So our unemployment went up. What happened in our production possibilities frontier? Well, Normally, when you draw a production possibilities frontier, you know, it's got to be two different goods. If we want to do the entirety of all our goods, we could say all capital goods and consumer goods, consumption goods. Anyway, capital goods, consumption goods. And we were at point A, and now that we are in a recession, we are not producing at our full employment. We shifted, and we're at less than full employment, so we're at point B. Let's see, and then on the foreign exchange market, this would be the, since we're doing it for US dollars, quantity of US dollars, and we'd have to give it, I'm just going to use euros for our example. Euros, how many euros per dollar? And there was an exchange, and there was a certain demand for US dollars, and there was a certain supply of US dollars. As we go into recession, we don't have as much money. If we don't have money, we don't want to buy stuff, and that includes foreign stuff, stuff from Europe. And so actually the supply of US dollars is probably going to decrease as US consumers no longer, there we go, as US consumers no longer want to buy European goods, and that will actually drive up the value of the dollar. Now, you might have some other effects on there too, but the initial effect there is going to be, as we're in recession, we're buying less stuff, including international stuff, and so the value of the dollar is actually going to go up. So what would happen if the government increases spending? Well, let's go back to where we are currently in a recession. So there's aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, price level, we're at price level 1, and output 1, and this is real GDP. And a recession, so this is where we're at. The idea here is part of aggregate demand is government spending. Oops, let me do this like this. Here we go. So if we increase government spending, we get aggregate demand plus that increased government spending. However, because of what we have over here on our consumption function, draw this in again, 45-degree line. We had our consumption function, which had dropped a little bit. Oh, you know what? I forgot to label my... Oh, that's okay. I'll come back to that. No, I won't. Because of the government spending, we might get to a slight increase. So I'll call that y plus g, so I'll call it y sub g in our output. But we're also going to get, with that increase in government spending, that's part of autonomous spending. So our consumption function is going to shift up by the increase in government spending. And so, this graph shows, maybe not that great because I'm not the best drawer in the world, is that the increase in income, oops, I should label these things, is actually, I'm gonna label that y sub c. You'll see why in a second. But the increase in that consumption spending was actually greater than the increase in the government spending, and that's because the government spent some more, but that turned into income that people turned around and spent as well. So we get that multiplier effect that, again, 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So we get a bigger total effect here. So let's see, this is, what am I forgetting here? Income, forgetting some labels, and expenditure. Okay, and so what that ends up looking like is we get not just the increase of government spending, but we're also going to get an increase, I'll draw this over here, in aggregate demand plus government plus consumption. Whew! Because we got that big multiplier effect, and so that might increase our GDP by a lot. However, some will argue that that's a pie in the sky dream, that it doesn't actually work that well, because we've got our third graph here, the loanable funds market. So the quantity of loanable funds and the real interest rate, and we had a demand for and a supply of loanable funds with a market interest rate and a quantity. As the government decides to start spending to get us out of this recession, they're going to run a deficit. If the government runs a deficit because of additional spending, that means they're going to have to borrow money. And so the demand plus the government demand, I shouldn't label that as G, that's really a bad label. The government, I'll just label it as D1. Anyway, that is going to cause an increase in the overall demand, which is going to drive interest rates up. Well, if interest rates are up, go back to this model, and we'll grab green, grab red, we might get an increase in government spending and that increase in consumption. But if interest rates are high, businesses are not going to want to borrow money, and we're actually likely to see some decrease in investment. So this is the plus the government spending plus the additional consumption minus the loss of investment. That's called the crowding out effect, and that got us back to this point here. And so hopefully that helps get us back to, or at least close to, full employment. However, that's not the only thing that the government was doing to try to get us back on track. One of the other things they were doing was increasing the money supply. So let's draw the money market. By the way, to increase the money supply, I think I talked about it before, but so this is quantity of money, and this is the price of money. Really is in the money market is the nominal interest rate. So we had a demand for money, we had a supply of money, and we had an interest rate. There we go, nominal interest rate of whatever that is. What happened was we increased the money supply. We did that. I always have to stop and think about this. But in order for the Fed to increase the money supply, they need to buy something. Put your place in the place of the Fed. If you want to give money to somebody, you got to buy something from them. So that we'll just call this buy government securities. When they did that, the interest rate fell. which the point of that was hopefully to encourage more investment, which will drive aggregate demand and aggregate supply, or aggregate demand up and back up to full employment levels. Alright, in the loanable funds market, we're going to see a fairly similar effect. Demand for loanable funds and the supply of loanable funds. And this is really just quantity of loanable funds, and the y-axis is the real interest rate. And these two are somewhat tied together in this case in the short run. Real interest rate is really the nominal interest rate minus inflation. So if the nominal interest rate is dropping, real interest rate is probably dropping as well. And indeed it is. The effect of that buying government securities means they're buying them back up from banks. Means banks have more money in order to loan. And so the supply of loanable funds is increasing. Oops, I forgot to draw in my interest rate, but real interest rates are going to be dropping initially as well. Let's stay black there. So that was the initial interest rate and that lowering interest rate. All of this is to say that in the short run, what we are going to see, or what we are hoping to see then, as an effect of the increasing money supply, is that the aggregate demand will increase. So we were at this point here, the point of the price level, I gotta get all my labels in here, real GDP. The point of the increasing the money supply was hopefully to increase aggregate demand, because businesses are more likely to borrow money to invest because it's really cheap to, and so the hope there is to increase aggregate demand, get us back to full employment. Alright, lastly, what's happening in the exchange market then? And I could go on, there's probably a lot of other effects that are happening as well, but let's look at one last thing here of the monetary policy, what's going to happen to foreign exchange rates. So this is the quantity of US dollars, and our price, we were just going to use euros, how many euros per dollar. And the effect of the, and we were at, there. Alright, the effect of the effect that we saw of the increased money supply was that we had decreasing interest rates. Well, if interest rates are lower, I don't know that if I were a European and interest rates are low in U.S. banks that I want to bother investing, putting money into U.S. banks or buying U.S. bonds, because those interest rates are really low. So, because of that lower interest rate, we're going to see, oops, let's grab a pen, a decrease in the demand for US dollars, and the value of the dollar is going to shrink because of that monetary policy. So you kind of have some counteracting effects on a number of these things if we were to look at them in total. When we increase the government spending, it's going to increase our consumption function. It's going to increase our total consumption by more than the amount of the government spending, at least theoretically, because of that multiplier effect. But then we're going to look at it because we're probably going to have some deficit spending, and so we're going to lose some of it, and we're going to end up back. We're going to get that crowding out effect. Meanwhile, this was driving up the interest rates, this government spending, but meanwhile, if the Fed is trying to lower interest rates, that's going to also have the effect of increasing the demand, and it's going to counteract the effect of the increased government spending in the loanable funds market a little bit. And in the foreign exchange market, we're also going to have some counteracting effects there. We went into recession, the value of the dollar increased, and then the ways that we use to get us out of the recession actually is going to decrease the value of the dollar again. And again, there are probably a lot of other things that I can and should say about it. There's only one last thing that I am going to say, though. This example kind of modeled a bunch of the different graphs and how they would model these effects of Keynesian economics and Fed increasing the money supply. Not all economists would agree. Not all would agree. Classical economists would say that, look, we're in this position right here. I'm actually going to do this and add another layer sheet here. I wouldn't suggest writing this down on your own paper, at least not the way I'm going to do it here. But if I were a classical economist, yeah, let's do this. And we were in this position here, where we are below full employment. A classical economist says we don't need to worry about all this other stuff. We don't need to increase government spending. We don't need to do that, because if we leave it alone and we're below full employment, people are going to want to come back to work. And so what's going to happen because of this? Wages fall, and you notice price level is going down, so input prices for making goods is falling, and because of that, aggregate supply will take care of itself. Aggregate supply will increase, and we will get back to full employment. So a classical economist would say, look, we don't need to do anything. Leave the economy alone. It will self-correct, and we will be fine. The classical economist would say the same thing if we had a problem with inflation. If we have inflation, well, that's going to drive up wages and everything, which will increase the cost and decrease aggregate supply. So a classical economist believes this and says, hey, yeah, this might be true, but this is not long term. The Keynesian economist would say, look, I don't know what short term is. Short term might mean we get stuck at this point right there for a very, very long time. I might be dead before we see your effect of aggregate supply shifting back up. We need to act quicker. We need to do something, and so let's increase that government spending. And that's perhaps the biggest difference between the classical economist and the between the classical economist and, man, I can't push the right button here. There we go. Between the classical economist and the Keynesian economist in terms of what we need to do when we get to this position here. Thanks, I hope this helped. I know these videos ended up being a little longer than I had intended, so I broke them into a variety of different parts, but hopefully they help you as you try to prepare for the AP exam.